Hi everyone. Thank you for joining us today, whether in person or online. My name is Dr. Immigrant. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the CIDP. So I will really briefly introduce the research who contribute today to the presentation, and before handing over to Dr. Scoppio, Grace. So Dr. Grace Scoppio, whom you know, she's a professor at the RMC. She's also affiliated with the Department of Politics Studies at Queen's University, and she's a member of the CIDP too. And she will present it today, the presentation. Her co-author also, they are not here, but they work with her. So we have Dr. Amy Vieira. She's a professor emeritus of sociology at Northwich University. And we have also Sarah Hogenkamp, a PhD student in social work at UCLA. So you can find all their biography on the CIDP website. So that's why I will speak very briefly. And I will now give the floor to Dr. Scoppio, and you will have just 30 minutes, and after we have some questions.
Merci. Thank you, Emily, for this introduction, and thanks to the CIDP team for supporting the project in various ways. And welcome everybody to the first IDP speaker series talk for this term. So I've had the honor and pleasure to be hosted at the CIDP for the past 6 months during my sabbatical. And in this time, one of the focus of my research was the project that I'm going to speak about today. Again, my project team, Amy Vieira and Sawyer Hogenkamp, could not travel to Kingston today, but it's very much a collaborative effort. I would like also to acknowledge the funding support for this project has been provided by my own home institution, the Royal Military College of Canada, through various research grants. Let us begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we're on today, both here in Kingston and for those of us who are joining us virtually. Let us take a moment to recognize the importance of the land on which we're located in Kingston. It's the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee peoples, and we're all very grateful to be able to live and work and enjoy these lands. So my collaborator, Amy Vieira, whom I met while I was doing my Fulbright at Norwich University in Vermont in the States in 2021. Also the current RA for the study is Sawyer Hogenkamp, a Queen's graduate, currently doing a doctorate at UCLA. And again, as Emily mentioned, the full bios for the research team are found on the CIDP website. In addition, I'd like to acknowledge the support received in the last 3 years by our former RAs. All were graduate students here at Queen's at the time. So Alex Olteanu, followed by David Baido-Anu and Jaguo. So thank you all for your contribution to the study. As an interesting point, both myself and Amy are immigrants to Canada. I was born in Italy and came when I was 14 to Canada. Amy is American and currently living in Canada. And this has facilitated our understanding of our participants' migration experiences. And interestingly, our previous RAs were also immigrants to Canada from different parts of the world. And Sawyer is a Canadian, but he's studying in the US. So he also has that experience of living in a different country. So we'll start with a little study overview, a little bit about the research design and the methods, some demographics about our participants, a brief overview of the literature, and some of the key findings to date, some of the overall takeaways, and what have been our knowledge mobilization activities so far, and the way ahead for the study, and then we'll open up for discussion. So through a prior study on immigrant participation in the armed forces of 12 different countries, it came to light that there's not a lot of research on immigrants in the armed forces from an international and comparative perspective. And particularly absent are the actual voices of the immigrant service members themselves. As we know, many countries rely on immigration to sustain their population growth and their workforce. And Canada is not immune to this. And indeed, neither are its allies. Again, Canada and its allies have very high rates of foreign-born among their population. On the other hand, immigrants leave their homes in search of a better life, to reunite with family, or for economic or humanitarian reasons. And they bring to their new country a much needed human capital, cultural capital, and they fill in a lot of workforce gaps. And some of them serve in our military. So due to the limited research on immigrants in the armed forces, we embarked on a qualitative study to explore the different immigration experiences, their different military service experiences, using narrative inquiry to elicit the stories of immigrant soldiers, aviators, and sailors. We started the study in the spring of 2021 while I was still at Norwich University in the States. And the idea is to collect the stories of immigrant soldiers either serving or having recently served in the militaries of the Five Eyes. So Canada, the United States, Australia, the United Kingdom, and New Zealand. The objective of the studies are to advance knowledge regarding the experience of immigrant soldiers, compare approaches across the Five Eyes, and inform Canadian defense policy in this area, as indeed the Canadian Forces only recently opened military recruitment to permanent residents of Canada to address some shortages in the military. In the presentations, we may use the term immigrant soldier, but we're clearly referring also to sailors and aviators in other branches. So in terms of our research design, we really want to capture the lived experiences of immigrant soldiers through their own stories and using narrative inquiry as a qualitative research approach involving the reconstruction of a person's experience in relation both to the other and a social milieu. Through narrative interviewing, participants tell their stories in a communicative process where the interviewer's primary role is to listen and we learn from the storyteller. So we don't really have a predetermined research question or hypothesis. We don't have a strict questionnaire, but we adopt a narrative inquiry to reveal their own stories and uncover how they're shaped by multiple social factors, such as the migration experience, the experience in the new country, the experience in the military, and their families and their groups outside of the military. So in terms of our methods, to begin, we started by activating our own networks to identify the initial participants. Once these initial respondents were identified, we used snowball sampling technique to identify additional respondents, because this is kind of a difficult to identify population. Most of the interviews were conducted virtually on video, and 4 with just audio, and 8 were in person. We use Microsoft Teams to record and automatically transcribe the interviews. However, the transcriptions are not perfect, the machine-generated transcription. So we independently verify them by 2 members of the team for accuracy. Then the transcripts, they form the corpus of the analysis. We use MaxQDA software to code the transcriptions based on emerging themes. To inform the study, we consulted literature from various social sciences disciplines. So for example, we looked at immigrant military participation, inclusion and exclusion. We looked at different capitals that immigrants bring, human capital, social, economic, cultural, and linguistic, which influence also the experience of the individuals. We also looked at the recruiting challenges, demographics, and also the opportunities that these immigrants might have in the civilian sector. And so the military really has to compete with other employers. And also, in terms of our lateral transfers, there's the idea of a shared set of military cultural values, and that might influence their migration decision. So there are specific national programs for foreign-born soldiers with prior military experience that we'll explore in the next couple of slides. So I'll explain that to you. And they are sometimes referred to as lateral transfers programs. So military service can be a means to a new national identity and to citizenship through military service. So these soldiers find a place for themselves, both within the military and in society. So just to give you an idea, so we have so far 56 participants, and they are literally from every continent. The majority are from the United Kingdom, as mentioned. We have quite a few lateral transfers, so UK citizens who travel to other English-speaking countries of the Commonwealth, namely within the Five Eyes, but not necessarily in the US, and they continue their service in a new military. We also have some participants from Canada, Iraq, Italy, Germany, Ukraine, and you name it, every corner of the world, pretty much. In terms of service and a country of service, we have 22 so far from Canada, 10 from Australia, 14 from the US, 5 in the United Kingdom, and 5 in New Zealand. The majority of participants are male. However, this is also a reflection of the military themselves, where, as we know, for example, in Canada, less than 17% are female. So in terms of ages, we range from the 20s into the 60s because, again, some of our participants are just retired. So by military rank and branch of service, the majority of our participants are officers, but we have a good sample of also non-commissioned members or enlisted, if you want to use US language. And we have a good reflection across different branches of the military, with the majority being from the Army. Again, not surprisingly. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time here just to give you a little aperçu, little overview of the different approaches towards immigrants in the Five Eyes. So prior to October 2022, only Canadian citizens could join the military in Canada. Non-citizens individuals could only join if they had a specialized skill set, such as, say, for example, a trained pilot or a doctor. And they could join through a not very well-known program, not very well advertised program called a Skilled Military Foreign Applicant Entry Plan, with an offer of a position from the military. However, their immigration efforts, their whole journey would be on their own. Almost 2 years ago, in October 2022, it was approved that the Canadian Forces can now recruit permanent residents of Canada. Good news. However, since then, the number of permanent residence recruits has not significantly increased, despite the increase in applications. And this is due to severe delays in security checks, by and large. So just to put in perspective for you, of a military that's a little over 100,000, so quite small, combining reserves and regular force, we have a shortfall of about 17,000 positions. So we need to increase our numbers. Now looking at Australia, for years, Australia has been actively recruiting individuals with prior recent military experience from allied countries. Additionally, starting the 1st of July 2024, so very recent, non-Australian citizens can join the Australian Defence Force, starting with New Zealand permanent residents, and they've been the first one eligible to apply. And next is going to be, starting January, basically, it's going to be permanent residents living in Australia from the rest of the Five Eyes. So the United Kingdom, the US, and Canada. In New Zealand, they did have a lateral recruitment program, however, of prior service Five Eyes citizens. However, this has been paused. So they have basically on their website, it says, due to recent criteria changes, we're temporarily unable to recruit overseas candidates who required a skilled migrant category visa. That said, any other immigrant who is a legal New Zealand permanent resident can apply through the usual application process to join the military. The US leads here. Any permanent resident or other work eligible visa holder may apply. And this has been the case for decades. Immigrants are actively recruited through policies that allow for accelerated citizenship via military service. In addition, for a brief period, well, not that brief, it was about 7 years, from 2007 to 2017, non-work eligible visa holder with specialized linguistic skills or healthcare professionals could join and have a pathway to expedited citizenship through a program that was called MAVNI, Military Accession Vital to the National Interest. This was suspended during, I believe, the former Trump administration. Now, looking at the figures, around 45,000 foreign-born personnel serve in the U.S. military at any given time. Lastly, looking at the United Kingdom, they've been recruiting citizens of any Commonwealth country and from the Republic of Ireland, again, for decades. In addition, they have a special regiment for Gurkhas, and they serve under special and unique arrangements, and they remain citizens of Nepal. So basically what has been changing is that you no longer have to be a resident of the UK as a Commonwealth citizen, and you're exempt from immigration control upon enlistment. So they have a lot of sort of a facilitated pathway, if you will, for Commonwealth. And then you qualify to apply for citizenship after 4 years of service. At this time, give or take, the British Armed Forces include about 12,000 personnel from foreign and Commonwealth countries. So, as mentioned, we have gathered 56 interviews so far, and we present here some preliminary findings based on partial analysis of these interviews. We would love to collect a few more, so we are looking forward to doing a bit more data gathering before we wrap up the study. So we have some telling quotes. I won't read all of them, but I'll read one telling quote or two maximum for each of the slides. So looking at the Canadian Forces, only 19 of the 22 CAF interviews were analyzed so far. So we present here a couple of the telling quotes drawing from the 19 interviews that were analyzed. So for example, one of the themes that has come through, which again, not surprisingly, as I mentioned, the whole experience of the immigration process is lengthy, inefficient, and convoluted. And then we've heard this over and over. So for example, Ruben says, a lot of paperwork to get organized, police records, records of service, official secret stuff as well. I had to fill in loads of that. It was particularly complicated for me because of my time in Belize. So as soon as you've been out of country in the past 10 years, your time for the securities clearance is exponentially multiplied. That meant I had to go chasing other information from that country, as well as, believe it or not, I had to do an IELT, an international English language testing, to prove I could speak English from an Anglophone country, from an English-speaking country. Now, another theme in terms of their military career. So for the lateral transfers that came from the UK military with quite a bit of not just years of experience, but operational experience, okay, literally all over the world and Northern Ireland in some cases, there was lack of support in this transition and indoctrination. So for example, James says, because there was no transition course for me when I came over, you know, there's no, this is the way things are done in Canada or in the Canadian military. I really had to, every time I made a mistake, I had to make it a learning experience. Also, interestingly, even though we're recruiting some of these soldiers with prior experience, we're not really tapping into that experience well. So for example, Kay says, when I actually arrived and would occasionally sort of say, well, in London, we did it this way. And that worked quite well for us. So in the Royal Air Force, this is the approach that we would take. And we found it very successful. Or we tried that and it wasn't very successful. I quickly got told by quite a few people, actually, look, we're not interested in what they did in the UK. It's different here. In terms of their personal lives, sometimes there's some challenges from a cultural perspective because we are, you know, every country's different. You arrive, especially if you arrive a little bit older, you're going to find some challenges. So for example, Jane says, Canada has a very strong culture of niceness. We can relate to that, right? Sorry, thank you, how are you? But I don't really care how you are because it's just part of the etiquette. Like in Eastern Europe, it's very dry. People are not going to smile at you if they don't like you. I feel we're much more blunt, much more straight up in our communication. I definitely consider myself a blunt person. And sometimes people think I'm rude because of that. Well, it's like I have no intention of being rude. Now, let's move to the Australian Defence Force. In terms of their stories of immigration, what we reported, what we heard was their process of citizenship and the whole process of immigration was smoother. So, for example, Nick, so they have 90 days. So after you join, you have 90 days to qualify for citizenship if you join as a non-citizen. So Nick says, when I came over, I had to do 90 days service to qualify for citizenship. So I went to the immigration in Brisbane City, actually went to the office on my 90th day in uniform and with my application. And I said, I'm here to become a citizen. And because I turned up and I was sort of sitting in front of them, they processed me in 2 hours. Sorry, I should mention that only 7 of the 10 ADF interviews to date were analyzed so far. So these are just the highlights of the interviews that were actually analyzed. Still with the ADF, stories of military career. By and large, lateral transfer of members, they dropped in rank. So this is interesting because we're recruiting people based on their experience. And a lot of them had, like I said, loads of operational experience. And then we dropped them in rank. So that was kind of interesting. So for example, Nick says, and then I transferred to Australia in 2013. I had to drop in rank to Lance Corporal. It's like marking time. It feels like when you come across, you've got the experience and the knowledge, but you haven't got the rank or the position. Also, sometimes immigrants experience stereotypes. Frank says, they use some nicknames for me for sure. What I really don't like is when people know I'm Italian born and they primarily ask about food or dress. But it places additional pressure on me to show them I'm not just a pasta guy, I also know how to do the job. In terms of personal life, we saw a lot of Commonwealth team across Canada and the UK, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia primarily. So for example, Bob says, well, I remember a good friend of mine asked me, well, you know, why do you want to go to Australia? What about your loyalty to Canada? And I said, well, Australia is part of the Commonwealth. I mean, I was still very much, the Commonwealth is quite a unique thing. So the Commonwealth is alive and kicking. And it's a really strong uniting factor, if you will. And another thing some of the soldiers said is that in terms of the loyalty, like their oath is to the same monarch. So now the king, but up until a little while ago was the queen. So they felt pretty much the same loyalty because the oath is to the monarch, really. New Zealand had some different themes coming across, and we did, however, code and analyze all the 5 interviews collected so far. So one of the themes that came across is that people moved literally across the world without even having been to New Zealand, without knowing much about New Zealand, more following sort of like a myth and the idea of New Zealand. So it was kind of interesting. So for example, Simon says, I'd never actually visited New Zealand, neither had my wife. Something appealed to both of us about it, and they just packed and went. The immigration process was quite disorganized. Kieran says, I had 2 years dealing with immigration and no help from lateral recruiting whatsoever. So these were soldiers that were basically guaranteed a job as they transferred over from the UK to New Zealand, but they had to deal with the whole immigration process on their own, and they found it quite challenging. In terms of military career, the theme of dropping a rank was back. And in addition, sometimes they were actually told that they would not get promoted. Borderline discrimination. So Raphael says, the senior career manager for the Army said in an open conference with 12 career managers plus some other observers, and I quote, no Brit will ever receive selective or representative post in the Army. And so that's what you're up against. Yeah, the prejudice is very real. Brits are #1 on top of the pile for prejudice. So this must have some basically colonialism roots, and we heard this theme before. In terms of personal life, it was a bit of a mixed bag. Some felt they encountered a little bit of discrimination. Some had positive interactions in the community. And the other theme that has come across, not just these, but also other interviews, immigration is very much a family affair, okay? So unless you're leaving the country young, you are moving with your family. And so if you're married, your spouse is going to be part of that decision. But in terms of positive interaction, Raphael says, now, despite my concerns, my disappointment with the organization and the senior leadership, most of the men and women I work with are wonderful, especially the younger ones. They've got no prejudices. They're an absolute pleasure to be around. The vast majority of people you'll meet in everyday life are fairly wonderful, very wonderful people. When we first arrived, we were immersed in New Zealand friends. And one of my wife's work buddies was Maori. Now, very different themes in the US military. We found a lot more that came from poverty or from war-torn zones. And I read you, for example, and I should mention as well, we have only analyzed 11 of the 14 interviews collected so far. So Wahid's story is pretty tragic. Unfortunately, in 2007, my dad was on that list. He was captured, tortured to death for 9 days. It was very hard to hear. Some of the stories, I got to tell you, it was very hard to hear. They killed him. I couldn't even go to his funeral. They found him on the side of the road. The US Army drove by his body a couple of times, but they didn't pick it up because they used to rig bodies. They put IEDs in them. I couldn't stay any longer, but I gave up on everything. I took my mom, my 2 sisters, and my little brother. We left to Turkey. And in Turkey, they said, we can't keep you here because Turkey does not take immigrants. So we're going to have to relocate you to another country, which happened to be the United States. And 2 years after that, they brought us here in 2010. Amazing stories, I have to tell you. Stories of resilience that really are amazing. In terms of stories of military career, we heard a lot about zero policy, about anything around discrimination, and a lot of acknowledgement about diversity, and a lot of support for some of these immigrant soldiers. So Andrew says, for example, he was my first sergeant. He came out and he said, and how did now an Iraqi kid like you end up within our ranks? I remember fighting in Baghdad. So where were you? In case I ran into you somewhere. So when I explained to him, and he actually was referring to me as a brother. So amazing stories. A lot of gratitude towards the US military as well, and towards the country for providing some of these soldiers, some of these immigrants, a new life. Andrew says, again, coming from a different world, different life, finding life here, finding the future, having a meaningful life in the United States. We're a land of immigrants. Everybody have been an immigrant at some point. And that's what makes it great, because we're coming from places that we didn't want to be. We've come here. We should, embrace the positivity and actually show that would work. Thank you for taking me. Thank you for bringing me here. Thank you for saving my life. Thank you for providing me all these opportunities. That to me was just a dream, and now it's a reality. In addition, we found that the military provides some of these soldiers with American identity. We heard over and over again when we said, how do you think of yourself? And a lot of them, they said, I'm American, or I'm an American soldier. Moving towards the British Armed Forces, these 5 interviews were not analyzed through the software, but rather manually, the old-fashioned way with a highlighter. So we also found some refugees in this population. For example, Mustafa left Sudan in 1990, moved to the UK as a refugee, sought asylum in the United Kingdom. So he's been there since the age of 8. So his father received threats and they literally had to leave the country the next day. Excuse me. I won't have time to go through a lot of these, but just suffice to say that we did find a little bit also of some experiences of bias and discrimination as well, but also the same theme of acculturation through the military, through the army, and other such things. And in terms of personal life, I have to read this because this is really interesting. Jules says, to be honest, I never thought I'm an immigrant. I just shift from one to the other. I don't have a split personality, but I have a split life. When I'm in Hong Kong, I live like a Hong Kong person. When I'm in Scotland, I live like a Scottish person. I never thought of migrate. I just moved from one place to another, and I still call Hong Kong home. Edinburgh, the second home, or home in the UK. So I thought that was an interesting way to put the migration experience. Very quickly, some of the overall takeaways, some dimensions of social, human, and cultural capital that facilitate or interfere with the immigrant service experience, immigrant service member experience. And also, there seems to be a bit more friction in military life for the soldiers that laterally transferred from another military. The other thing is there's also different experiences in terms of different cultures within the Five Eyes military. These narratives uncover extraordinary stories about the impact of migration and can inform future immigration and military policy and practices to better support them. Very quickly, some of the knowledge mobilization activities. We do have an article published in the Journal of Military and Strategic Studies that presenting the results of the analysis of 19 of our 22 interviews with the Canadian Armed Forces immigrant members. We've also presented at 4 conferences, both in Canada and the US, with one more presentation at the Inter-University Seminar on Armed Forces Society right here in Canada. It's a conference that's 1 year in Canada, 1 year in the US. Strongly recommended for anybody who's interested in these issues. And of course, through the CIDP network, in addition to our talk today, we are hoping to submit a policy brief and also participate in a podcast in the forthcoming months. We are going to wrap up data collection. Again, we would love to have a few more interviews, complete the analysis, and report the findings, possibly in a monograph. We don't feel we can do justice to all the voices, all the interviews that we've collected through short articles. So we're thinking a longer publication to really do justice to these immigrant soldiers that have so unselfishly, I can't say it, given their time to us and contributed their stories to us. This is just an annex of the rank time of interview, references, and open for discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Scoppio. So you can, if you have a question, you can just ask the questions. We already have 3 questions online, so we can, if you have, we can start here or online.
Sure.
Anyone has a question? Okay.
Oh, we have questions.
With you and afterwards. Go ahead.
I was curious.
Do you want to introduce yourself?
Oh, I'm Bianca. I'm a student. I'm undergrad student here in political studies. You mentioned a lot of the soldiers that were immigrants in the American Army came from countries that were more war-torn or, had like stories of resilience. Do you think there's more of those people in America because the American Army has such like a view around the world as being like an army that, does a lot of like peacekeeping or fights for democracy? Like, do you think there's a reason why they have like a more immigrants who come from this like resilient background in their army?
They have, well, first of all, it's the biggest military in the world, right? So their recruiting is astonishing. They recruit a lot of people, they recruit them fast, number one. Number two, yes, for example, some of the, we had a story of somebody who was an interpreter for the US Army in Iraq. And that's the path that he took to come, right? So their presence across the globe operationally is staggering. And so their manpower needs, human power needs are also very big. And they have multiple pathways to come. And, you know, they've been recruiting non-citizens for decades, regardless of the country of origin. So, you know, we're coming late to the game, and Canada is coming late to this scenario because of the recruiting shortages, but our system is too slow. Their system is a lot faster. So you know, we just heard these soldiers say, you know, it's the American dream. Like they're there and they don't even want to go back. A lot of them, they don't want to go back.
I'm Matthew Brown. I'm also a Queen student.
Nice.
The School of Graduate Studies in the History Department. My question to you was to do with, you said you started your research in 2021. And I guess my overarching question is, what were the motives to begin that research? And was it informed by things like the withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021, or perhaps, you know, this being before 2022, when Canada authorizes PRs to begin the enlistment process into the CAP? Or was this research always going to happen irrespective of outside events?
It's a really good question. So I mentioned before, I led a study looking at immigrant participation in the armed forces in 12 different countries. And the study, some of the outputs were a big workshop actually organized through the CIDP, and also a book. And what came through is that there's not a lot of research that is telling the stories of these immigrant soldiers through their own voices. And also, if it does exist, it's very much country-centric. So there might be a study in the US, for example, but to look something comparative, there's not a lot out there. So it was more to fill a research gap. It was not necessarily linked to Afghanistan. That said, I've been proposing, for lack of a better word, that Canada open up recruiting to permanent residents for quite a long time. And so we also had a policy brief through the CIDP saying as such, they need to start. This was before we even had a recruiting challenge. It's just looking at the labor force. Look at the labor force, and you need to be ahead of the curve. So if we have, you know, over 20% of the labor force that's foreign born, employers can't sit there and think, oh, well, we're only going to recruit citizens. No employer can do that. They just can't. So, I'm glad Canada has finally changed that policy, but now we need to expedite the process to get some of these permanent residents through the doors. Good question.
Hi, I'm Bob Martin. I'm with the center as one of the research fellows. And up until budget cuts, I was teaching at RMC and Queens. So now I'm underemployed. Anyway, just more of an observation than a question. My 2 tours in Afghanistan, I was with the Combined Joint Special Operations Task Force, which is a Five Eyes organization. Now, you said that the US military has very strict policies on discrimination, but I found that the Marine Special Ops and the Navy SEALs in particular were rapidly anti-homosexuality. And they said, well, being a Canadian, like, you're homosexuals can get married? Yeah, we call gay marriage marriage. But so did you research come up with any of that? Any complaints about sexual discrimination?
That's a very valid point, and it did not come through. It was, I think the comments were more based on racial discrimination. There is no tolerance for that. But also I'd say religious, because we did have, for example, a participant that was Muslim and reported only support. So that's not to say that racism doesn't exist in the ranks, but what they said is that there is no tolerance for it. Good point, though.
Hi, Grace. I'm Adam Worm, a visiting fellow from the Canadian Armed Forces working at CIDP this year. I found your presentation very interesting, and what spoke to me was this tension that may be a bit more prevalent for lateral transfers in terms of like a bit more friction. And, from my perspective, I would suspect that that's there has something to do with the effectiveness of military enculturation in general and latency from the nation of origin. I'm just curious, though, to this point, did you notice any heightened frictions internal to Five Eyes or Commonwealth compared to those testimonials you've heard from people transferring from non-Five Eye or non-Commonwealth?
I don't think we have that granularity, to be honest with you, in the study. All I can tell you is that although Canada has this program to sort of recruit members of other militaries allied militaries who have specialized skills, the program is not well advertised, and basically you're on your own through the whole immigration process. And when you arrive, there's no real indoctrination, no real sort of, okay, this is how we do things here. And so I'd say Australia probably was the one that did the best job with the lateral transfers. And New Zealand now stopped it, so they're not even doing it anymore. So I'd say of the three, probably Australia would be a good model to see how they're doing it. And then they have the 90 days. So I think we should go to Australia and look at it, Adam.
Thanks a lot, Grace.
So I think that we'll take like some questions online.
Sure.
So we have a question from Mark So. He said, thank you for the interesting panel. I would like to ask if there is research done on culture views by the immigrant communities when someone from said community joins the military. I speak of the sense of when someone from the community does not have a positive view of the militarity in the Five Eyes countries.
I'm sorry.
Pas compris?
No, speak up a little bit. Oh, sure. Do you want to come over? Sure. Let's do it like this. It's quite long and I'm trying to, sorry. Very good question. I would like to ask if there's research done on cultural views by the immigrant communities when someone from said community joins the military. I speak of the sense of when someone from the community does not have a positive view of the military in the Five Eyes country. I think the research that is out there that defense does anyways, I can tell you, they do research on desire is not the right word, attraction, right? So how attractive is the military, say, for example, for the Chinese community? It's not the right word, but you know what I'm saying. So that kind of research exists within defense. I don't know in terms of the actual experience of, for example, we're talking about Asian members, their experience in the military. And that's why we're doing this study, because I'm not sure how much of that is out there. Propensity to join, that's the word I was looking for. So there's a research done on a regular basis by defense about different communities' perspectives and their propensity to join the military. So that exists. In terms of the experience within the military, I don't think that there's a lot by community.
Do we have another one here?
So I'm Jamie Witchlow. I'm a Queen student via ROTP. I was just wondering if in your research you heard about like expatriate organizations and how immigrant soldiers like kind of integrated that into the new country. I don't know if that came up at all.
Oh, I see. That would be really interesting. We didn't reach out to these organizations. That would be a very good idea. So thank you for that suggestion. But for the UK, we did not have personal contacts. And so we did tap into networks. So that was really useful. But that's a very good idea. Expat organizations would have been a good idea. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for the question.
Hi, my name is Lee. I'm staff here. Just in terms of themes that emerged from the data, for any of the respondents, did they indicate that they perceived overlaps between national culture and institutional cultures for the militaries or organizations they were now joining as like new immigrants?
I would say the closest example I can think of is one of the quotes we had, for example, was about New Zealand and how this particular soldier felt well integrated into the New Zealand Army. No questions there. The soldiers were fine, but then they found some sort of difficulties in terms of integrated in New Zealand society as they were perceived, I think, as basically, in terms of colonization, because they have a British heritage. So I think the sort of integration in the military, sometimes it can be easier than in society in some cases. In other cases, it just depends, right? So it was very much depending on the country. But I'd say overall, there was no big discrimination in society, a little bit more in New Zealand. That's based, again, on our respondent population, which was all white male from the UK. So I think they encountered a little bit of challenges because of that, because of their ethnicity, because they're perceived as, coming from the UK and all that. Other than that, I think most people had positive experiences, and for sure, the ones in the States, they seem to have very good experiences. And like I said, some of them didn't want to go back because they're coming from war-torn countries and they had no desire to go back. Some did, but some didn't. So they felt fully American. Really good questions, everybody.
Okay, so we have online 3 other questions. The second one is, did you study distinguish between reserve force member and regular force member? From Michael Rostock.
Yes. Hi, Mike. So it's a very good question. We do have some members of the reserve, but we didn't really see a big difference in terms of their experience. I think the main difference is that they're part-time soldiers, so they're not fully enmeshed in the institution. And sometimes they might have some operational experience and sometimes they don't. So I think that's one of the main differences. But in terms of the immigration experience, that's very similar. Basic training is the same, well, sort of the same. So that part is very similar. Yeah, some experiences were positive and some were less positive. So I think we mentioned one Asian sailor had not a very positive experience. And felt that it was probably because he was not Caucasian. And he was reserve, sorry, he was Navy Reserve in the UK, so the Royal Navy Reserve.
Third question from the director of the CIDP, Dr. Combs. Grace, thank you for a balanced and interesting presentation. Do you have any thoughts on best practice of military takings in immigrant reserve force?
Thank you, Howard, for the question. So I think we need to sit down and put on our thinking hat, and that's our next deliverable for the center. So we'd like to publish a policy brief through the CIDP. And I think that's going to be the idea, to go through our data, which is a lot. So each interview was an hour or longer. So for anybody who's done qualitative research, 56 interviews of over an hour is a lot of data. So we really need to go through it a little bit more carefully to really distill what are some of the best practices. But say, for example, just very rough, in terms of the lateral transfer, I don't think the Canadian Forces do a really good job with it. It's not well advertised, and the process is you're pretty much left on your own. So yes, it gives you a job, but there's no facilitation of the whole immigration experience. And the immigration process itself is very lengthy, very convoluted. So I think Australia might be a good best practice to look at in terms of the lateral transfer. In terms of overall recruiting of permanent residents, I would say the US is an excellent best practice, both in terms of the how open they are and the expedited citizenship once you join. So the joining process is faster and the citizenship process is faster. But this has to be coupled by policies at the end of the day. So if we are going to open up the door to a lot of what we call in Canada visible minorities, because a lot of our immigrants are visible minorities, right? Our number one country of immigration is India, followed by China. So by and large, our newcomers are visible minorities according to the Employment Equity Act. So we need to couple that with strong, very strong policies, to fight discrimination and racism 100%. Otherwise, we need to be welcoming, not just, okay, you're in now and you're on your own. No, we need to couple that with all sorts of different policies to make these new soldiers, sailors, and air personnel feel very welcome in the organization. So expediting the process and expediting the joining process, the citizenship process once you join, and then making sure that we are a welcoming and inclusive organization once people are in. Thanks, Howard, for the question.
You have another one here?
Drew, I know you want to ask me a question.
You have
Drew
one?
is our visiting defense fellow from the US Army, so I thought he might have a question, but maybe not. I want to put you on the spot.
So I am Lieutenant Colonel Drew Lanier. I'm the visiting defense fellow from the United States Army here until about June next year. But one of my first conversations with Grace, she talked to me about this program. I think you got to talk to a few of my former soldiers from Fort Jackson, South Carolina, who are finance soldiers and also immigrants. And so this is very intriguing. This information has actually kind of spiked interest in my policy brief. What I'm going to work is how do we better influence that policy for the security and the background checks, because it does seem exceedingly long. So I guess I'm looking into this myself, but how does it compare if it's 18 to 24 months for an immigrant to join the CAF? What is it for a citizen? Is it dramatically better? Because I don't get the idea that it is.
It is faster. However, the footnote to this is because of the length of time that they look at, if you have lived for a significant amount of time out of country, that triggers all sorts of further security checks. So in an ideal case, you are a Canadian citizen who has not left the country for a significant period of time for the past 10 years. And then it would be a lot faster, everything else being equal. But even as a Canadian citizen, if they've been out of country for a period of time, they will experience delays, and it could be 12 months or longer, even for them. I know that from experience because it took a year to get security, the secret security for me, because I had lived in Italy. We know Italy, those Italians. So that was my experience, very, very long.
Thank you. Another one? Still have, I think, 5 minutes.
Hey, any last questions? We have anything online?
So we have one on.
Sure. Is there a correlation between country monetary wealth and affordability on that nation's ability to be better at diversity, equity, and inclusion? Compare poor country, would these pay less attention to DI? That's an excellent question. And I honestly, I don't know the answer to that. I can tell you in Canada, we have our own policies. We can do better for sure. The other thing that our policies don't cover is intersectionality. We look at people in a binary way. So you are a visible minority, you are a woman, you are an Indigenous person, you're a person with a disability. But people have multiple identities and we don't really have policies for that. And we don't really capture that data either very well. So I think that there's a lot to be done in this space. And we shouldn't really pat ourselves in the back and say, oh, we have the policy of multiculturalism, we have employment equity, at least for the Canadian case. We know for a fact that there is still discrimination within the forces. We have reports that prove that. We've had cases of sexual misconduct. And so on and on it goes. So we should not pat ourselves in the back because we can all do better as organizations and as governments in general.
Okay, we still have 5 minutes. I will give you.
Thanks, Colonel Chris Purdy, visiting defense fellow too, I guess. Yeah, Grace, I'm interested to see just in the themes that are starting to come out, if you're noting any major differences between those who have enrolled through the lateral process versus new enrollees. And when we look at expectations versus outcomes, are you noting a higher level of dissatisfaction amongst those who have come in laterally versus those kind of new immigrants who are enrolling fresh, for lack of a better term?
I would say, very roughly speaking, the answer is yes. Because when somebody comes as an adult, first of all, to a new country, and they have all this, like I said, these soldiers have a lot of operational experience, and then we do them a disservice by we downrank them, number one. We have no kind of transition for them, no kind of indoctrination for them. So there's a lot more challenges. And then, so we are recruiting them based on this experience, but then if somebody says, hey, this is what we did when I was deployed in Iraq with the UK Army, with the British Army. And we say, no, we're not really interested in how they did it in the UK and the British Army. So then we're not really maximizing their experience either. So I think these are some of the frictions that they're encountering. But you're a full colonel. If you went across the pond and I downranked you to a lieutenant colonel, but you've been operating as a full colonel for years, very hard to switch gear. So that's the other challenge that they're encountering. So because for years this is their leadership position was at this rank. Let's call them citizen soldiers, the ones that are recruited, that did not have prior experience, then they're going through the whole basic training. So they're much better integrated into the military. And so I think their expectations are also different. It's not like a second career. So in our paper that we published, we call the lateral transfer the second act in a way. So in the case of somebody who just joins straight up, they're really looking for a first career. So I think they're also much more engaged and much more invested into their military. So they're encountering a little bit less friction because they're going through all the steps, all the training. There's no skipping steps. There's no downranking, right? So I think the lateral transfer program is a good idea, but I think it needs some work. And so that's just a few thoughts, like very rough. Good question though. Did you have a question?
Yeah, Matthew Brown, sorry, I have a question for you. I imagine that you'd want as many people as possible to come across your work. But when you're creating this work and throughout the process has it changed, that do you have a specific niche target audience in mind to specifically take your work and like take the product that comes from your research that you can do? Or is it really just anyone?
So it depends on the product. So for output, I should say product is not really the right word, but say for the policy brief, our target will be the Canadian government, the defense, right? So I think our recommendations would be very specific to national defense in Canada. An article in a journal, I think it's a broader, it's a different audience, more academic. And so, somebody who works in policy in national defense might not read our article, but we're hoping they might read our policy brief. And then say the podcast might be maybe more, I don't know enough about who the audience is for the podcast. It's going to be my first time, but I'm thinking again, it's a broader audience, and it might be a lot of students perhaps who listen to this type of media. So I think the academic pieces are more geared towards an academic audience, students and graduate students and academics that are studying in this space. A policy brief is more for a defense audience. And who knows, if we write a monograph, then that would be amazing. And I hope that different people read it, even potentially immigrants that are thinking about joining maybe the military, just to get an idea of what are some of the advantages and some of the challenges. And the hope is that it's going to be across the Five Eyes, so that we can, that if we do produce a monograph, that it's read across the Five Eyes country. So that would be a dream. Very far from that, but it's good to have a goal, right, in any research. So thank you for the question.
Thank you. I think that you need to stop this talk. And if anyone has another question, you can reach Grace, Dr. Scoppio by email or just directly speak with her. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.